A king's signature could command armies, but the ink he used could bankrupt a treasury. This is the secret history of medieval pigments, the substances that gave color to power itself. By the end of our journey, you will see the entire map of the medieval world redrawn not by kings, but by the quest for color. We will follow the trails of artists who crossed deserts for a perfect blue and uncover why a single shade of purple was worth more than a castle. What forgotten sacrifice do you think lies behind the colors of a masterpiece? Within the hushed silence of a monastic scriptorium, a monk dips his brush into a pot of liquid light. He is not painting with simple dyes. His colors are ground from minerals dug from deep within the earth, from rare stones hauled across continents, and from insects patiently harvested on distant oak trees. These were medieval pigments, and they were alchemy in its purest form. Transforming the raw stuff of the world into divine radiance was a power that went far beyond mere decoration. The vibrant red on the page was not just red, it was the blood of martyrs ground from the mineral cinnabar, a substance so toxic its vapors could drive a man mad. The shimmering gold leaf was not merely metallic, it was the light of heaven itself, painstakingly applied to reflect the glory of God, but perhaps the most telling was the blue. A deep, celestial blue known as ultramarine, meaning beyond the sea. It was made from Lapis Lazuli, a gemstone found in only a few remote mines in Afghanistan. To procure it, a patron had to fund a journey of thousands of miles. The result was a pigment so expensive that its use was often specified in contracts, a single ounce costing more than its weight in gold. To commission a painting rich in ultramarine was not just an act of piety, it was a blatant, glorious display of wealth and influence. Color was a physical form of currency, a condensed symbol of divine light, royal authority, and raw economic power. And this understanding that a specific shade could be worth a king's ransom is what would soon push men to risk everything in a global hunt for the rarest hues on earth. That deep celestial blue was a luxury, a statement of divine favor, but the color of blood and fire was a necessity. In the bustling markets of Venice, merchants from the east unloaded heavy, carefully wrapped parcels. Inside was not silk or spice, but a heavy, ruddy stone known as cinnabar. This was the raw material for vermilion, the most brilliant red the medieval world had ever seen. To produce the pigment, this stone underwent a dangerous alchemy. It was heated in a sealed vessel until it sublimated, transforming directly from a solid into a toxic vapor, which then condensed as a brilliant red powder. The process was so hazardous that the artisans who mastered it risked mercury poisoning with every batch. Yet the demand for this vibrant, almost unnaturally perfect red was insatiable. It was essential for illuminating the blood of martyrs in sacred texts, for adding a flush to the cheeks of the Virgin Mary, and for the wax seals that authenticated the decrees of kings and popes. Its power was not just symbolic, it was visceral. This demand created arteries of trade that stretched across the known world. Caravans carried cinnabar from the mines of Almaden in Spain, a site so vast its output would fund empires for centuries. Other routes snaked their way from the distant reaches of China, where the mineral was also prized. Every kingdom needed this red, and their reliance forged deep economic dependencies. A pope in Rome needed a steady supply for his chancery, and that need connected him to a Muslim merchant in Cairo, who in turn dealt with a miner in Spain, all bound by the scarlet thread of commerce. But vermilion was not the only red on the palette. For a more earthly, less costly hue, artists turned to red ochre. This was a humble pigment dug from the earth in almost every region, a color of clay and iron oxides. It was the color of the earth itself, used for painting rustic scenes and filling in backgrounds. This duality tells a profound story. The medieval world was connected not just by the trade in luxuries like Lapis Lazuli, but by the constant, grinding need for the very substances that gave their world its visual language. The brilliant, toxic vermilion and the common, earthy ochre flowed along the same routes, illustrating that the desire for color, in all its forms, had already woven a global network long before the term was ever coined. And this network was about to be tested by a quest for a color so elusive, it would push explorers to the very edge of the map. Yet the most powerful journeys were not always taken for gold or conquest. Sometimes they began with a single color missing from an artist's palette. Think of a master illuminator, known only for the beauty he created within the safe walls of a monastery. For years, he has mixed his greens from local plants, producing hues that are serviceable but dull, lacking the vitality of a true spring leaf. He hears whispers from traveling merchants of a mineral, a green earth found in the mountains of Cyprus that possesses an unmatched clarity and depth. This knowledge becomes an obsession, so he makes a choice that defies his entire sheltered existence. He packs his brushes and joins a merchant caravan, trading the certainty of the scriptorium for the perils of the open road. His motivations were a complex tapestry. There was the pure, burning desire for artistic perfection, the vision of a masterpiece that could only be realized with that one perfect pigment. There was also the practical lure of a generous payment from a bishop or nobleman who demanded nothing but the finest. And for some, there was simply a restless curiosity, a need to see the sources of the colors that had flowed into his workshop for years. This artist-explorer would face bandits on dusty mountain passes, endure the searing heat of deserts and the bitter cold of high altitudes, and navigate markets where he did not speak a single word of the language. His journey was a quiet act of immense courage, all for the chance to return home with a small, precious pouch of a new green or a more brilliant yellow. He was not a king expanding an empire, but his quest helped to map the world in a different way, connecting cultures through a shared hunger for beauty. This drive for creation to bring something new and wondrous into the world proved to be a force as powerful as any army. And sometimes the greatest prize of all was a color that could not be found, but had to be invented through a secret and dangerous art. High in the jagged mountains of Afghanistan, the Sar-e-Sang mines were a landscape of breathtaking sacrifice. Men dangled from ropes on sheer cliffs, their hammers tapping in a lonely rhythm against the rock face. They were not searching for gold or silver, but for a stone of deep, celestial blue, Lapis Lazuli. This was the only known source in the entire medieval world. Each fragment they pried loose was a piece of the sky made solid, a treasure that would embark on one of history's most astonishing journeys. From those remote peaks, the raw lapis began a trek of thousands of miles. It was loaded onto the backs of camels in heavy sacks, joining the great caravan routes of the Silk Road. It passed from the hands of Afghan miners to Persian merchants, who transported it across the deserts of Central Asia. It was traded in the bustling markets of Baghdad and Damascus, its value increasing with every league it traveled west. Venetian traders, the masters of Mediterranean commerce, finally secured the precious stone, shipping it across the sea to their lagoon city. From there, it was sold to the workshops of Florence, Siena, and Bruges. The journey took years, and by the time a single, rough chunk of lapis reached a European artist, it had already accrued a cost greater than most men would see in a lifetime. But the journey was only half over. The transformation from stone to light was a ritual in itself. master grinders would take the lapis and carefully crush it, separating the precious blue particles from the dull gray calcite and the flecks of fool's gold that naturally occurred within the rock. This was a slow, meticulous process, often done by apprentices under the strictest supervision, for even a speck of this powder was worth a fortune. The resulting pigment was a blue of impossible depth and intensity, a color that seemed to glow from within the painting. It was given the name ultramarine, meaning beyond the sea, and its use was never casual. An artist would reserve this most holy of colors for the most sacred elements of a composition. It was almost exclusively used for the robes of the Virgin Mary, a visual declaration of her heavenly status and the divine favor of the patron who paid for it. So when you stand before a medieval altarpiece and see that radiant blue, you are not just looking at a color. You are seeing the Afghan mountains, the dust of the Silk Road, the skill of the Venetian trader, and the devotion of an artist who knew he was handling solidified light. This single shade connected a miner swinging from a cliff face to the quiet prayer of a worshipper in a European cathedral, all through the universal language of beauty. Yet while ultramarine was a treasure hauled from distant mountains, another vital green was born in the dank air of a basement workshop. A medieval alchemist would suspend thin copper plates over a pot of simmering vinegar, then seal the entire chamber for weeks. He was not brewing a potion but cultivating a color. Slowly, a crust would form on the metal, a brilliant, acidic green known as verdigris. This was chemistry at its most visceral, a pigment created through corrosion. It was a common green, affordable enough for painting the robes of saints and the leaves of trees in 1,000 illuminated manuscripts, but this accessibility came with a hidden cost. Verdigris was notoriously unstable, often fading or darkening over time, and more alarmingly, it was corrosive. The very acid that created it could eventually eat through the parchment or panel it was painted on. The artist handling the raw pigment risked burns on his hands and, with constant exposure, damage to his lungs from the toxic fumes. This was the grim bargain for a splash of green. For a more stable and majestic green, the artist turned to malachite. This was a mineral, a beautiful banded stone of deep green, mined from deposits across Central Europe. To transform it into paint, the stone had to be ground into a fine, shimmering powder. This process filled the air with a fine dust that artisans inhaled day after day, leading to chronic respiratory ailments and poisoning. The lush, rolling hills in a landscape painting, the rich drapery of a nobleman's tunic, each stroke of green was a potential health hazard. An artist's life was a constant gamble, trading years of his health for the vitality on his canvas. His workshop was not always a place of quiet contemplation, but sometimes a chamber of slow, invisible perils, where the very materials he used to capture life could, in turn, steal his own. But no pigment was guarded more fiercely than the color of kings. In the bustling ports of ancient Tyre, the air hung thick with the smell of salt and rotting shellfish. Workers toiled in vast open-air vats, crushing thousands upon thousands of murex sea snails. From the glands of these small mollusks, they harvested a milky liquid that, when exposed to sunlight, underwent a miraculous transformation. It turned first a pale green, then a deep blue, and finally settled into a rich, enduring purple. The process was revolting and incredibly inefficient. It took as many as 10,000 snails to produce a single gram of dye. This was the legendary Tyrian purple. By the time of the Roman Empire, this color had become the ultimate status symbol. Emperors draped themselves in robes of this profound hue, and they enacted strict laws called sumptuary laws that made it a crime for anyone else to wear it. A common merchant could be the richest man in the province. but if he dared to cloak himself in Tyrian purple, he would be seen as challenging the emperor's divine right to rule. This was not merely a fashion statement, it was a brilliant piece of political theater. The color itself became a weapon, a visible, wearable representation of imperial power. When a Byzantine empress gave birth in a special chamber lined with purple stone, her child was known as a porphyrogenitos, meaning born in the purple. This was not just a cute nickname, it was a direct claim to the throne, a statement that the child was royalty from its very first breath. The monopoly on purple was a way to color code the social order, making the hierarchy of the empire instantly visible to every citizen, from the lowest farmer to the highest senator. The staggering cost of the dye, funded by the state treasury, was not an extravagance, it was an investment in control. It proved that a pigment could be more powerful than a sword, weaving authority directly into the threads of a royal garment. While the royal purple spoke of earthly power, the shimmer of gold leaf reached for the heavens. Step into a dim cathedral and behold an altarpiece bathed in the flickering glow of candles. Its golden background does not simply shine, it seems to breathe, to pulse with a life of its own. That radiant surface was not paint, but pure gold, hammered by hand into sheets so thin they flutter on a breath. The application of this gold leaf was a sacred ritual. An artist would first prepare the wooden panel with layers of gesso, creating a perfectly smooth, white ground. Then he would carefully apply a sticky, reddish-brown clay mixture called bole. Breathing gently on the bole to reactivate its tack, he would then, with the utmost care, lay down a sheet of that fragile gold using a special brush. Finally, he would burnish it with a smooth stone or even a wolf's tooth until the surface reflected light like a liquid. This was not a display of wealth for wealth's sake. In a world lit only by fire and sunlight, that shimmering gold was a physical representation of the divine. It was the uncreated light of God, a visual metaphor for a heaven that had no night. The halos of saints and the backgrounds of sacred scenes were gilded to show that these figures existed in a realm beyond our own, a space of pure, untarnished spirit. Gold, being incorruptible and eternal, was the only material deemed worthy to symbolize the divine essence. So the artist, in his painstaking labor, was not merely a craftsman. He was a theologian, using his hands to build a bridge between the material world of the viewer and the immaterial glory of the divine. The quest for the finest gold was not driven by greed, but by a profound desire to make the invisible visible, to give mortal eyes a glimpse of eternal radiance. And this sacred ambition would soon meet its most formidable challenge, not in the realm of metals, but in the search for a color so elusive it seemed to mock human effort entirely. The true cost of a color reveals itself not in the market, but in the workshop. Here, the epic journeys ended and the meticulous craft began. A master illuminator's workshop was a symphony of controlled chaos, a place where raw, earth-born minerals were systematically transformed into divine light. An apprentice, his arms aching, would press a heavy, glass-handled muller against a granite slab, grinding a lump of Lapis Lazuli with slow, circular patience. Each rotation was a meditation, reducing the precious blue stone to a powder so fine it felt like silk between the fingers. This was the first and most crucial step, for a coarse pigment would ruin the flawless surface of the vellum. Nearby, another apprentice worked with a mortar and pestle, crushing malachite into a shimmering green dust that filled the air with a dangerous metallic tang. The master himself presided over the final alchemy. He would crack a fresh egg, skillfully separate the yolk from the white, and then carefully mix the viscous yolk with a small mound of his most valuable pigments. This was tempera, the medium that would bind color to the page. The chemistry was perfect, the egg yolk creating a durable, fast-drying paint that would retain its brilliance for centuries. His palette was not a wooden board but a collection of old oyster shells, each one holding a different, carefully mixed hue. With a fine-tipped brush made from squirrel hair, he would begin the painstaking work. He applied the paint in thin, translucent layers, building up color and shadow with a patience that seems almost unimaginable to us today. A single leaf on a border could require a dozen separate applications, each one needing to dry completely before the next could be added. This was not a process of swift inspiration, but of devout ritual. Every brilliant red initial, every golden halo, was the final link in a chain that stretched back to a merchant caravan crossing a desert, a miner dangling from a cliff in Afghanistan, and the alchemist patiently corroding copper plates in a vinegar fog. The grand adventure for color found its ultimate purpose in this quiet, focused room where risk and sacrifice were distilled, stroke by meticulous stroke, into permanence. The true architects of the color trade were not kings or artists, but the merchants who mastered its flow. While the artist risked his health and the miner his life, the merchant gambled his entire fortune on the safe passage of a color. His world was one of ledgers and tariffs, of shipping manifests and complex exchange rates. He did not need to know how to grind Lapis Lazuli, only how to get it from a mine in Afghanistan to a workshop in Florence before his competitors did. This required a nerve of steel and a network of trust that spanned cultures and religions. A single Venetian merchant house would finance an entire caravan, advancing huge sums of money to local agents in Alexandria or Constantinople. They assumed every risk, from pirates on the high seas to bandits on the Silk Road, from a sudden storm sinking a galley loaded with cinnabar to a shift in political winds that could close a border overnight. Their profit was the reward for this colossal gamble. When that precious cargo finally arrived, its price had multiplied tenfold, covering the cost of transport, the bribes to customs officials, the taxes at every city gate, and the interest on the initial loan. The merchant's ledger tells a story of high-stakes speculation on color itself. He might buy up the entire season's production of a particular red ochre from a mine in Hungary, creating an artificial scarcity that would drive up the price for every artist in Italy. He was not merely a transporter, he was a market maker. This sophisticated commercial machinery was the invisible engine behind every masterpiece. The lone artist explorer could never have sourced his perfect green without the vast, interconnected web of traders, bankers, and insurers who made such a journey financially possible. Their capitalism, ruthless and calculating, was the very foundation upon which the Renaissance was built. The next time you admire the deep blue of a virgin's robe, remember the merchant who studied the weather patterns and political alliances, betting his gold on the hope that a ship carrying crushed blue stone would make it to port. He was the middleman who turned raw material into legend, and his story reveals that the market for beauty has always been one of the world's most perilous and profitable games. A masterpiece's color palette was its signature, the deep, somber blues that defined the celestial calm of a French Gothic manuscript did not emerge from artistic philosophy alone. They were born from a specific and limited supply chain. French illuminators, often working under royal or monastic patronage, had reliable access to ultramarine blue, but its staggering cost meant it was used with a profound sense of restraint. This limitation became a virtue. Artists built entire compositions around this one majestic hue, using it to create a mood of spiritual gravity and intense focus. The brilliant blue of the Virgin's robe was not just a color, it was the emotional and theological center of the entire page, surrounded by more muted earth tones and less expensive blues like azurite. This created a distinct visual identity, one of solemnity and divine order. Cross the Alps into Italy, however, and the artistic world exploded with a different kind of light. Italian panel paintings, especially those from cities like Siena and Florence, are renowned for their brighter, more varied, and almost celebratory palettes. This was not merely a difference in taste, it was a direct reflection of geography and commerce. Italian city-states, particularly Venice, were the central clearinghouses for all pigments entering Europe from the east. An artist in Florence had access to the same ultramarine as his French counterpart, but he also had a wealth of other options arriving daily in the harbor. Brilliant vermilions from Spain, rich greens from Cyprus, and exotic yellows like orpiment flowed more freely and affordably into the Italian market. This abundance encouraged experimentation. An Italian master felt no need to conserve his one precious blue. He could weave it into a tapestry of other vibrant colors, creating a sense of earthly splendor and dynamic energy that mirrored the bustling, wealthy mercantile society he lived in. The very definition of beauty was thus shaped by local economics. A school of art could be identified by its dominant red, a crimson that spoke of trade alliances with one region, or a particular green that revealed a city's access to mines in another. The colors on a 15th-century altarpiece are a frozen record of medieval geopolitics, a map of ancient trade routes painted in mineral and plant. So when you look at a painting, you are not just seeing an artist's vision, you are reading the economic ledger of his city, a vibrant testament to how the flow of commerce forever shapes the language of art. That devotion to craft exacted a terrible physical price. Behind the brilliance of a medieval masterpiece often lay a palette of slow poisons. Consider the artist reaching for a radiant, sun-like yellow. He would open a jar of orpiment, a pigment made from arsenic sulfide. Its color was unmatched, a vibrant, almost metallic yellow that seemed to capture light itself. But to use it, he had to breathe in its dust. He would lick his brush to form a fine point, unknowingly ingesting minute amounts of the toxin with every stroke. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning began subtly, a slight tremor in the hands, a persistent cough. Over time, they worsened into violent stomach pains, debilitating nerve damage, and disfiguring skin lesions. His dedication to that perfect yellow was quite literally costing him his health. An even more common danger was white lead. This was the brightest, most opaque white available, essential for creating highlights, painting flesh tones, and mixing lighter shades of other colors. To produce it, artisans would expose sheets of lead to vinegar fumes, scraping off the corrosive white crust that formed. Artists then ground this poisonous powder into their paint. Chronic exposure to lead dust led to lead poisoning, known then as painter's colic. It caused severe abdominal cramps, paralysis, memory loss, and a slow, irreversible decline into madness. The very substance used to illuminate a saint's face could cloud the mind of the man who painted it. These were not rare accidents, but accepted occupational hazards. An artist knew that his chosen vocation might shorten his life. He accepted this grim bargain because there were simply no substitutes that could achieve the same visual effects. The reckless dedication required to use these materials daily speaks to a profound truth about this era. For these men, the creation of beauty was not a gentle pastime. It was a physical sacrifice, a dangerous alchemy where the price of capturing divine light on earth could be measured in their own vitality. That vibrant yellow in a halo, that glowing white in an angel's wing, they are not just colors. They are the preserved evidence of an artist's courage and his suffering. A dusty, handwritten ledger from the 1400s holds more truth than a dozen history books. Within its precise columns, a Venetian merchant named Marco Laurdan recorded the cost of a single ounce of Lapis Lazuli, the bribes paid to Ottoman customs officials, and the losses incurred when a mule carrying a load of vermilion tumbled from a mountain path. This was not a story of art, but of logistics. His dry entries give us the tangible evidence we need to trace the entire journey of a color. We learn that the price of ultramarine doubled between Alexandria and Venice, not because the stone itself changed, but because of tariffs, transport fees, and the merchant's own considerable risk. These primary sources, these travel logs and account books, are the unsung heroes of our story. They transform the grand narrative of the color trade into a series of very real, very human problems. A merchant in his log might complain of bandits forcing a caravan to take a longer, more expensive route through a high mountain pass. He would note a sudden spike in the price of red ochre after a local war disrupted mining operations in Hungary. We hear his genuine frustration when a shipment of ornament arrived caked and useless after a storm soaked the cargo hold. These are not abstract economic forces. They are the daily obstacles documented by the people who faced them. This is how we move from speculation to documented fact. The merchant's pen recorded the world as it was, a fragile network of trust and danger, all dedicated to the movement of powdered earth and stone. His primary concern was profit, not posterity, but in meticulously tracking his business, he accidentally preserved the entire anatomy of a forgotten global market. So the next time you see that brilliant blue in a Renaissance painting, remember that its journey is not a mystery. It is written down in ink in the ledger of a man who knew the cost of everything, especially the price of beauty. The merchant's ledger told a story of scarcity, but the alchemist's furnace whispered a promise of plenty. In smoky, fire-lit laboratories far from the dust of trade routes, these proto-chemists attempted the impossible. They sought to transmute common materials into precious color, to conjure an artificial ultramarine from ash and copper, or to brew a safer, cheaper red that could rival the toxic glory of vermilion. Their quest was born of pure economic pressure. The demand for brilliant pigments far outstripped the perilous, slow supply, and if nature would not provide enough, then human ingenuity would have to fill the gap. One of their most persistent dreams was to create a blue that could stand in for the priceless Lapis Lazuli. They would mix powdered glass with copper and cobalt compounds, heating the concoction in a crucible, hoping for a miracle. The results were usually disappointing, a dull, greenish blue that lacked the depth and luminosity of the real stone. Yet with each failure, they meticulously recorded their processes, the temperatures, the ratios, the strange reactions they observed. They did not know it, but they were slowly, painstakingly, inventing the scientific method itself. The line between magic and science was impossibly thin in these workshops. An alchemist might recite an incantation over his mixture even as he carefully measured its weight, believing that spiritual and physical processes were intertwined. His goal was not just chemical transformation, but a kind of philosophical perfection, the creation of an ideal color through the mastery of nature's hidden laws. While they never found their philosopher's stone, their accumulated knowledge of acids, bases, and metallic salts became the foundation upon which all modern chemistry would be built. Their failed pigments were the necessary precursors to the synthetic colors that would eventually flood the world. This desperate, brilliant, and often misguided pursuit reveals a profound truth about the age. The hunger for color was so powerful it did not just drive exploration and trade. It forced the very boundaries of human knowledge to expand, proving that the desire to create beauty can be one of history's most potent engines of innovation. A king's gift could speak without words. In the year 1400, a French king might dispatch a delegation to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, bearing not only formal letters but a sumptuous book of hours. The emissary would present the volume, its pages shimmering with gold leaf and awash in the deep, celestial blue of ultramarine. The message was instantly understood. Such lavish use of the world's most expensive pigments was a declaration of immense respect. It said, "I value our relationship so highly that I have invested a fortune in this single object." The pigments themselves were the true diplomats. A generous application of gold leaf signaled not just piety, but a treasury capable of funding armies. The dominant presence of ultramarine, painstakingly imported from Afghanistan, demonstrated a reach of trade and influence that stretched to the very edges of the known world. This was soft power rendered in mineral and metal. A monarch receiving such a gift was being courted with the evidence of his counterpart's economic and political network. The gift was an offering, but also a subtle display of strength. A less generous patron, perhaps one seeking to project frugality, or one whose coffers were simply not as deep, might send a manuscript illuminated with more azurite and less gold. The recipient, an expert in this visual language, would read the nuance immediately. The choice of color was a calibrated political statement, as deliberate and meaningful as the wording of a treaty. These were not mere presents. A book ablaze with color could soothe a territorial dispute, cement a military pact, or secure a royal marriage. The artists who painted these pages were, in effect, working in the diplomatic corps. Their mastery of color helped to weave the fragile alliances that held kingdoms together, proving that the most potent negotiations sometimes happened not in the throne room, but in the silent, radiant space of an illuminated page. The price of a color was measured not just in gold, but in acres of forest and tons of scarred earth. While merchants tallied their profits and artists risked their health, the land itself bore a silent, lasting cost. To produce the coveted red dye from Kerm's insects, artisans needed more than just the tiny bugs. They needed vast, ancient oak forests. These insects lived exclusively on the branches of a specific type of Mediterranean oak, and harvesting them was a painstaking process. Workers would carefully scrape the female insects, which looked like small berries, from the twigs. It took as many as 70,000 of these insects to yield a single pound of dye. The scale of production required to meet the demand for this rich crimson meant preserving enormous tracts of oak woodland, not for their timber but for their resident parasites. This created an entire economy dependent on a delicate, managed ecosystem. The landscape itself was being cultivated for color. In the mountains of Afghanistan, the quest for Lapis Lazuli left a different kind of mark. Miners dug deep pits and tunnels, quarrying the blue stone from the heart of the mountains. The rubble, the discarded waste rock, piled high in great slag heaps, permanently altering the contours of the valleys. The search for cinnabar in Spain created sprawling mining complexes that poisoned the local soil and waterways with mercury runoff, a toxic legacy that would persist for centuries. These were not small-scale operations. They were early, intensive forms of industrial resource extraction, all driven by the distant demand for a specific shade on a canvas or a piece of cloth. The brilliant red in a cardinal's robe or the celestial blue in a painting of the Virgin was, in a very real sense, made from entire ecosystems and rearranged geology. This history connects the quiet beauty of a medieval manuscript to the larger story of humanity's relationship with the planet. It reminds us that long before the modern era, our pursuit of beauty was already leaving a permanent footprint on the earth, a hidden cost written not in ledgers but in the very land itself. The same pigments that illuminated sacred texts also colored the banners that led armies into battle. In the swirling chaos of a medieval melee, A knight could not identify friend from foe by a face obscured by a helmet, but by the vibrant colors and symbols on a shield or a standard. Heraldry was not mere decoration, it was a visual language of survival. A soldier would scan the fray for a flash of his lord's specific red and gold, a pattern repeated across dozens of surcoats, all dyed with the same precious vermilion and costly ochres. The brilliant red on a banner, likely derived from kermes or madder, had to be bold and color-fast, resistant to sun and rain. Its loss on the field could mean the disintegration of an entire fighting unit, as men lost their visual rallying point. The durability of these colors was a matter of life and death. This martial need drove innovation in ink and dye recipes just as powerfully as the demands of artists. Military dispatches carrying vital orders between commanders were written with specially formulated iron gall ink. This ink began as a pale, watery solution, but upon exposure to air, it underwent a chemical transformation, bonding permanently with the parchment to create a deep, indelible black that could not be washed away by rain or blood. The very plans for the siege engines that battered castle walls, the detailed maps of enemy territory, all were drawn with these resilient inks, ensuring that crucial intelligence survived the rigors of a campaign. A single, fading map could lead an army into an ambush, just as a disintegrating banner could lead to its rout. The quest for permanent color, so vital for preserving divine beauty in the scriptorium, proved equally critical for securing victory on the battlefield, binding the fate of empires to the chemistry of a humble pot of ink. Yet the hands that ground the most brilliant blues were not always those of monks or male masters. In quiet convent workshops across Europe, women practiced the same sacred alchemy, their contributions often fading into anonymity alongside the pigments they so skillfully prepared. These nuns were not mere assistants, they were highly trained illuminators, managing every step of the process from raw material to finished page. Within the cloister, they cultivated gardens of specific plants used for dyes, meticulously harvested local minerals for earth pigments, and mastered the delicate art of grinding precious stones like Lapis Lazuli without wasting a single costly speck. Their work was both a spiritual devotion and a demonstration of profound technical expertise. A convent might become renowned for a particular shade of green, derived from a secret recipe of local herbs and copper salts known only to its sisters. The vibrant colors in a prayer book commissioned for a noblewoman, therefore, could be the direct result of another woman's knowledge and labor, a quiet network of female skill operating parallel to the noisy, male-dominated trade routes. Other women outside the convent walls contributed to this economy of color in more local, but no less vital ways. In villages, women often possessed the deep, generational knowledge of the countryside needed to gather plant-based dyes. They knew the exact time of year to strip the bark from alder trees for a rich black, which specific lichens produced the finest russet orange, and where to find the roots of the madder plant that could be processed into a brilliant red. This localized expertise formed the foundation upon which the entire pigment trade was built, supplying the common colors that filled the backgrounds of countless manuscripts and tapestries. Why have these stories been so difficult to find? The records are sparse. Many of these women simply did not sign their work, viewing it as an act of religious humility, or their contributions were recorded in ledgers under the name of the male head of a workshop or the abbess of their convent. But by carefully piecing together convent account books, letters, and the stylistic analysis of the artworks themselves, a clearer picture emerges. It reveals that the journey of medieval color was not solely a saga of male explorers and merchants. It was also the story of patient, diligent, and deeply creative women whose hands quietly shaped the visual world, proving that the legacy of these pigments is woven from countless threads, many of them held by artists history has yet to fully name. A new darkness settled over the palette of Europe. In the wake of the Black Death, a society hollowed out by unimaginable loss found its faith and its fears reflected in the art it produced. The brilliant heavenly golds and the celestial blues that once celebrated divine glory began to share the canvas with grim, earthbound hues. Artists turned to muted browns, dull greens, and shadowy grays, colors that spoke not of paradise but of the grave. This was not a failure of technique or a shortage of pigments. It was a profound psychological shift, a collective trauma rendered in color. The vibrant vermilion that once flushed the cheeks of saints was now used more sparingly, often reserved for the blood of Christ or the wounds of martyrs, a stark reminder of suffering and sacrifice. The most telling example of this new aesthetic is the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. In these chilling murals that spread across church walls, skeletons, painted in stark bone white and ashen gray, lead emperors, popes, and peasants alike in a final, democratic procession. The message was stark and universal. No one could escape death. The colors in these works are deliberately somber, draining the world of its earthly vanity to focus on the ultimate equalizer. This was more than a morbid trend. It was art holding a mirror to a shattered world. When a third of the population vanishes, the very purpose of creation is questioned. Why paint a world of splendid beauty when life is so brutally fragile? The answer artists found was to paint for the soul, not for the senses. Their palettes became a visual prayer, a meditation on mortality designed to prepare the viewer for the afterlife. This dramatic shift proves that the colors on a canvas are never just colors. They are a historical record of our deepest anxieties and hopes, a pigment-based psychology of an entire age. The next time you see a painting from this era, look past the subject and feel the colors. That somber green, that muted umber, they are the echoes of a generation's grief, a permanent reminder that art is always, inevitably, a product of its time. The tools of the artist's workshop have been replaced by the silent hum of a particle accelerator. In a modern conservation lab, a masterpiece rests on a platform, not under the harsh glare of a spotlight, but bathed in the invisible beam of an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. This machine does not see a painting of the Virgin Mary, it sees a unique chemical landscape. Each pigment on the canvas, from the deepest blue to the faintest flesh tone, contains a specific set of elements, a hidden fingerprint that this technology can read without ever touching the surface. When the beam strikes a patch of brilliant red, the spectrometer detects the unmistakable signature of mercury, confirming the presence of deadly vermilion. A scan over the Virgin's blue robe reveals sulfur, silicon, and sodium, the elemental identity card of Lapis Lazuli. This is not guesswork, it is a direct chemical conversation with the past. Scientists can now map an artist's entire palette with a precision the old masters could never have imagined, revealing not just what colors they used, but where those colors likely came from. The specific trace elements in a lump of azurite blue can be matched to a particular mine in Hungary. The unique impurities in a sample of red ochre can point to a specific clay pit in Italy. This turns every painting into a hidden travel log, its colors whispering the tales of its material's long journeys. This technology also acts as the ultimate art detective, uncovering secrets of authenticity and restoration. A conservator might discover that the vibrant green of a tree, long assumed to be original, is actually a much later restoration because its chemical signature includes modern synthetic compounds unknown in the 15th century. Or they might find that the face of a saint, looking slightly duller than the rest of the painting, was prudently painted with a cheaper blue because the patron could not afford enough ultramarine for the entire work. These revelations are more than just technical curiosities. They are tangible proof, written in the language of atoms, of the very stories we have been following, the economic pressures, the perilous trade routes, and the difficult choices artists made. The grand narrative of medieval color, once pieced together from merchant ledgers and risky journeys, is now being independently verified by the particles of the pigments themselves, connecting our modern curiosity directly to the alchemist's fire and the miner's toil. Some of the most important colors are the ones we can no longer see. Our vision of the medieval world is permanently incomplete, filtered through a lens of faded dyes and forgotten recipes. Consider the vibrant yellows and greens derived from simple plants like weld and broom. An artist would brew these plants into a brilliant dye, but these organic colors were fundamentally fragile. Exposed to light over centuries, they slowly surrendered their intensity, fading to a pale beige or vanishing entirely. This leaves us with a distorted picture. A tapestry that once depicted a lush emerald forest may now show only a dull, brownish landscape, its vitality leached away by time. The loss is more than aesthetic, it is historical. We have lost the specific emotional language of these colors. What did a particular shade of saffron yellow derived from the crocus flower signify in a royal garment? Was it a mark of joy, of wealth, or of spiritual significance? Without the original hue, we are left guessing, interpreting a muted echo instead of the full, vibrant chord. Even mineral pigments could be lost through their own chemistry. Some verdigris greens created from copper were unstable. Over the decades, they could slowly darken, turning a fresh leaf into a somber, almost black shape, completely altering the mood the artist intended. The most profound losses are the colors whose recipes have simply vanished. We know from written accounts that certain shades existed, unique mixtures of minerals and dyes known only to a single master or a specific workshop. Their formulas died with them, leaving only names in old ledgers, hues we can describe but never truly recreate. This absence forces us to remember that history is not just a collection of objects that have survived. It is also the ghostly imprint of all that has vanished. Every faded tapestry and every darkened panel is a reminder of the fragility of our cultural memory, and that the true color of the past may be one we are forever unable to see. The pigment trade was a financial force as powerful as any army. Venice did not simply trade in colors, it built its maritime empire on them. The city's wealth, visible in its shimmering canals and grand palaces, was directly funded by its ruthless monopoly on the flow of ultramarine, vermilion, and other precious hues from the East into the workshops of Europe. Every ounce of Lapis Lazuli that passed through the Venetian customs house pumped more gold into the state's coffers, funding navies, public works, and political influence. This concentration of wealth created a stark imbalance across the continent. A kingdom like France, desperate to adorn its cathedrals and manuscripts with the finest pigments, would see vast quantities of its gold and silver flow south, forever enriching its Italian trading partners. The very beauty that glorified a French king's reign could simultaneously weaken his treasury, creating a dependency that shaped foreign policy for generations. This was not a peaceful exchange. Control over key resources sparked intense rivalries and covert economic wars. The mines of Almaden in Spain, the primary source of cinnabar for vermilion, were such a strategic asset that they were fought over by kings and popes, their ownership shifting with the fortunes of war. To lose access to such a mine was to lose a primary color from your national palette, a visible sign of economic and political decline. The trade routes themselves became flashpoints. A single decree from the Ottoman Sultan, raising tariffs on caravans carrying Lapis Lazuli, could send shockwaves through the European art market, doubling prices overnight and leaving master artists idle, waiting for a color they could no longer afford. This delicate global network, woven from the desire for beauty, was perpetually on the verge of fracture. The pigment trade proves that the most potent economic engines are not always driven by necessity, but by aspiration. It was the desire for a perfect blue, not just for bread or armor, that redirected the flow of capital, built cities, and ignited conflicts, permanently entwining the history of art with the brutal realities of high finance. A legal contract from 1443 between the painter Neri di Bixi and his patron reads like a grocery list for paradise. It stipulates that the Virgin Mary's robe must be painted with the finest ultramarine blue, supplied directly by the patron at a cost of 4 gold florins per ounce. The contract did not trust the artist's judgment. It bound his hands with legal force, ensuring the patron's wealth was visible for all to see. This was not a suggestion, it was a clause in a binding agreement, a business deal for the creation of beauty. Patrons understood that the true cost of a masterpiece lay not in the artist's time, but in the minerals and stones that would give it life. To protect their investment, they often purchased the most expensive pigments themselves, doling them out to the artist in carefully measured quantities. An account book would record every gram of ultramarine received, and the artist was expected to return any unused portion. This turned the painter's workshop into a high-security vault, where the contents of a small clay pot were worth more than the annual rent on the building. Why such meticulous control? Because the pigment was the patron's direct link to global power. By specifying and supplying ultramarine, a wealthy merchant was not just commissioning a religious scene, he was demonstrating that his commercial reach extended all the way to the mines of Afghanistan. He was participating in the same international networks as kings and popes, using art as his receipt. The contract made the patron a co-creator, his economic might as essential to the final work as the artist's skilled hand. So the next time you admire the dazzling blue in a Renaissance panel, remember that you are also looking at a signed contract, a ledger entry, and a patron's proud declaration that he could afford to buy a piece of the sky itself. A color could cross a border even when a king could not. The most vibrant fusions in medieval art occurred not in spite of cultural divides, but because of the conversations that happened across them. In the royal workshops of Sicily, under a Norman king who employed Arab and Greek artisans, a remarkable synthesis took shape. Islamic masters brought with them a deep, scientific understanding of chemistry. They knew how to create vibrant reds from madder root using precise mordants, and they possessed advanced recipes for producing stable, brilliant inks. European artists, steeped in their own traditions of religious iconography, eagerly absorbed these techniques. The result was a new visual language, one where the intricate geometric patterns common in Islamic art framed Christian saints, all rendered with a newfound intensity of color. This was not a story of conquest, but of creative collaboration. Similarly, when Crusaders returned from the Levant, they brought back more than relics and battle scars. They carried with them a changed sense of color. They had seen textiles dyed with Tyrian purple and illuminated manuscripts with hues they had never encountered back home. This exposure created a new demand in Europe for deeper, more saturated colors, pushing merchants to seek out new sources and artists to experiment with new combinations. A European tapestry from this period might suddenly feature a particular shade of crimson, a color made possible by a dyeing technique learned from Persian weavers. This exchange was a two-way street. The same trade routes that carried Lapis Lazuli west also carried European vermilion and lead tin yellow east, where they were used to illuminate Persian miniatures and decorate Islamic ceramics. The pigment trade became a vast, informal university, a network where technical knowledge was as valuable a commodity as the colors themselves. A single color recipe was a piece of intellectual property, passed from one culture to the next, adapted and improved with each new hand it passed through. This constant, fertile exchange reminds us that the greatest masterpieces were never the product of a single, isolated genius. They were born from a world in conversation, a global dialogue where the shared hunger for beauty proved more powerful than any wall or creed. That very network of trade and knowledge did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It became the bloodstream of the Renaissance. The established routes that carried Lapis Lazuli from Afghanistan and vermilion from Spain were the same arteries that supplied the workshops of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. These masters stood on the shoulders of generations of anonymous artisans who had perfected the grinding of pigments and the chemistry of egg tempera. The material wealth of Florence and Venice, built on the color trade, provided the financial patronage that allowed a Michelangelo to spend years on a single fresco. The Renaissance was not a sudden explosion of genius in a vacuum. It was the magnificent, logical outcome of a centuries-long buildup of technical skill, global supply chains, and economic power, all centered on the mastery of color. This artistic revolution was intimately tied to a geographic one, the same desire that drove a merchant to finance a caravan across the desert now propelled kings to fund ships across the ocean. The quest for a direct sea route to the sources of spices in the East was also a quest for the sources of color. The valuable dyes and pigments of India and the Spice Islands were a primary motivator for explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. They sought to bypass the Venetian and Ottoman middlemen who controlled the land routes, hoping to secure cheaper, more direct access to the cochineal insects that produced a brilliant red, or the rare woods that yielded perfect blacks. The search for a perfect red, therefore, was a direct catalyst for the mapping of the globe. When you look at a Renaissance masterpiece, you are seeing more than a beautiful painting. You are looking at the end product of an economic system that spanned continents, a system so powerful it ultimately pushed European ships over the horizon in search of new worlds. The artist's palette, in the end, helped redraw the map of the entire Earth. A vibrant page in a medieval manuscript is a quiet explosion of history. It is not merely a beautiful object, but a frozen moment in a vast, interconnected world. Every color is a coordinate on a forgotten map, charting the ambition of a patron, the courage of an artist-explorer, and the intricate ledger of a global economy that thrived centuries before our own. The deep blue of the Virgin's robe connects a cathedral in France to a miner dangling from a cliff in Afghanistan. The brilliant red of a king's seal ties a royal decree to the toxic alchemy of a workshop in Venice. These were not passive decorations. They were active participants in history, driving exploration, funding empires, and forcing the very boundaries of science to expand. The legacy of these pigments is all around us, embedded in the masterpieces that define our cultural heritage and in the very ways we connect and create. It proves a profound and enduring truth that the human hunger for beauty, for that perfect shade of blue or that most radiant red, is a force powerful enough to reshape the world. We would love to hear which pigment's journey resonated most with you. Was it the celestial ultramarine, the toxic vermilion, or the royal purple? Share your thoughts below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten corners of history, subscribe for more adventures.